A summer night in Chicago, the Englewood neighborhood, a man steps out of a bar into the dark. He is a king, not a figure of speech. The streets actually call him king. He commands an army, thousands of soldiers. Grown men a head taller than him drop their voices when he walks into a room. The entire South Side knows his name, and most of them are afraid of it. And the people the rival king sent to kill him that night? Children, teenagers, boys who weren't old enough to drive the car they came in. They catch him in the doorway with the bar lights still buzzing behind him. They open up. He goes down on the sidewalk with multiple bullets buried in his body. And here is the part nobody in that doorway understood. Not the boys with the guns, not the doctors who would spend the night digging lead out of him, not even the king himself. He doesn't die. Not that night, not that year, not for a long, long time. The bullet is patient. It is going to take this man apart in slow motion over years, while the empire he built out of nothing swells into the largest street nation in the history of America. To understand the boy they sent children to kill, you have to go all the way back, past the army, past the crown, past the war, back to a cotton field in Mississippi. His name was David Barksdale, and this is the story of how a sharecropper's son became a king, and how the same streets that crowned him spent 6 years killing him. He was born in 1947 in a small town in Mississippi to 2 sharecroppers named Virginia and Charlie. He was the 10th of 13 children. 13. Picture that house. Picture that table. Picture what was left on a plate by the time it reached the 10th child in a sharecropper's family in the Jim Crow South. There was no money. There was no land that belonged to them. There was no future that the world around them was willing to hand a black child born into that life. The South had already written his story for him, and the ending was nothing. So in 1957, the Barksdales did what hundreds of thousands of black families across the South were doing in those same years. They packed everything they owned, and they joined the Great Migration North, chasing a rumor that a city called Chicago had jobs, had freedom, had a chance. David was 10 years old when he stepped off into the cold, and here is the first hard truth of his life. The promised land was a lie. What waited for the Barksdales in Chicago was not freedom. It was Englewood. It was Woodlawn, the South Side, neighborhoods where the factories were already closing, where white families were fleeing block by block as black families moved in, where the city quietly decided which streets were worth saving and left the rest to rot. For young black men in those neighborhoods, unemployment was running north of 30%. 30. The schools were overcrowded. The jobs were gone before they arrived. And the message, loud and clear, was that the city of Chicago had no plans for them. Now, here is something you have to understand about a place like that. When every official door is locked, boys do not sit quietly and wait. They build their own doors, their own rules, their own world, with its own kings and its own laws, because the world they were handed offered them no place to stand. And David Barksdale was about to build one of the biggest worlds the streets had ever seen. Within 3 years of stepping off that train, barely 13 years old, he had pulled the kids on his block together into a gang. They called themselves the Devil's Disciples. Now stop and let that sink in. 13 years old. Most boys that age are worried about a bike. David was building an organization, and Chicago in those years had hundreds of little gangs just like his. A corner here, a block there, A handful of teenagers, a couple of fights, and then they faded into nothing, the way almost all of them did. But David Barksdale did not fade. And the reason why is the most important thing about him. He didn't just fight rival crews. He absorbed them. While every other young leader on the South Side was busy killing the gang 2 blocks over for the sake of 2 blocks, David was doing something almost none of them had the patience or the vision for. He was thinking like an empire. When he beat a smaller gang, he didn't wipe it out. He folded it in. He gave its members a rank. He gave them a structure. He gave them a flag worth flying and a reason to fly it. He turned enemies into soldiers. One by one, the little crews of the South Side stopped being their own things and started being his. The block became a neighborhood. The neighborhood became a network. And by 1966, the little gang of teenagers had a new name that announced exactly what it had become: the Black Disciple Nation. A nation, not a gang, a nation. And the boy who built it had a new name too, King David. But you cannot build a kingdom on the south side of Chicago without bumping into another one. And the kingdom across the line from David's was a monster, the Blackstone Rangers. They came up out of the Woodlawn neighborhood, founded by 2 young men named Jeff Fort and Eugene Bull Hairston. And here is a detail that should give you chills. Jeff Fort was born in 1947, the same year as David Barksdale. 2 boys, born the same year, both carried north out of the South as children, both dropped into the same starving streets, and both of them grew up to crown themselves king of a rival nation. And the Rangers were playing the exact same game David was. They absorbed gangs too. They built a council of the leaders of the crews they swallowed. At their peak, the Rangers and the alliance they grew into could claim somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 members. They were older, they were bigger, they were, for a long time, more feared than the disciples. So the 2 nations went to war, and Woodlawn became a battlefield. This is not an exaggeration for a thumbnail. This is the actual historical record. The violence between the disciples and the Rangers got so constant, so normal, that the parents at one local elementary school started calling the playground Little Vietnam. Drive-bys, ambushes, snipers on rooftops, children doing the shooting and children getting shot. Retaliation, answering retaliation until nobody could remember which body started it. And through all of it, through years of open warfare on the South Side, King David did something that should have been impossible. He stayed free. Listen to this number because it tells you everything about the kind of operator he was. Over the course of his life, David Barksdale was arrested 25 times. 25. And he was never once convicted of a serious crime. When the police grabbed him, he would sometimes hand them a fake name, David Jones, and walk right back out the door and onto his throne. The most wanted gang leader on the south side of Chicago, a city run by the most powerful political machine in America, and the system could not make a single serious charge stick to him. 25 times they tried. 25 times he walked. The streets watched that. You don't earn a name like King by accident. You earn it by being the man the law itself can't touch. But Bull Hairston had stopped trying to put David in a courtroom. Hairston wanted him in a grave. And now we come back to that doorway. The order went out, and the people Hairston sent to fill it were not seasoned killers. They were teenagers. By some accounts, boys as young as 14. A rival king reached out and commissioned children to assassinate another king. They caught David coming out of that bar, and they put him on the ground with bullets in his body. And he lived. He should not have. By every law of the street, a man shot down like that in a doorway does not get up. But David Barksdale got up. He climbed off the operating table, he climbed back onto his throne, and he went right back to running his nation, while the man who ordered the hit, Bull Hairston, ended up swallowed by the prison system and, as the story goes on those streets, was eventually killed himself for the murders he'd tried to arrange. But that bullet did something the doctors could not undo. Deep inside him, it did damage that would never fully heal. And so the king walked back out into the daylight, already dying. He just didn't know it yet. Nobody did. The clock had started. It would run for 6 years. And here is where the story of David Barksdale turns into something almost no street king ever becomes. Because while he lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, the man who had spent a decade at war started doing a different kind of math. He counted the funerals. He counted the boys in the ground over a few square blocks of a city that never wanted any of them. He counted what all the winning had actually bought, and the answer was a neighborhood full of dead children and a playground the parents called Little Vietnam. And something in him broke open. Now, to understand what David did next, you have to understand what was happening in Chicago at that exact moment, because it is one of the strangest, most forgotten chapters in American history. In the middle of all this bloodshed, the federal government decided it wanted to hire the gangs. This is real. In 1967, a respected South Side community group called the Woodlawn Organization, led by a minister named Reverend Arthur Brazier, applied for and received a federal grant, nearly $1 million. The money came from the Office of Economic Opportunity, the centerpiece of the federal war on poverty. And what was the money for? Job training. For the gangs, for the Blackstone Rangers, and for the disciples. The theory was that these young men had already proven they could organize thousands of people, command loyalty, run a hierarchy across an entire section of the city. So the government's idea was, take that raw leadership talent, point it at job training instead of warfare, and hire the gang leaders themselves to run the program. Job centers set up right in the home territories of the Rangers and the Disciples, aimed at putting hundreds of unemployed young men to work. Think about what that means. The same teenagers the Chicago police were hunting were, on paper, now on the federal payroll. And David's disciples wanted in. Because here is the thing that money did. It gave the disciples a reason to stop shooting. To get their share of those federal dollars, they had to pursue peace with the Rangers. Suddenly, the bloodshed wasn't just costing lives, it was costing money. And nothing makes two warlords sit at a table faster than a paycheck. For a brief, strange moment, the gangs of the South Side stopped being just gangs. They marched. They pushed City Hall for jobs. They helped force open construction work for black laborers who had been locked out of it for generations. They ran breakfast programs that fed hungry children before school. They opened clinics in neighborhoods the city had abandoned. In some blocks, the same organization that used to recruit desperate kids was now feeding them. For a moment, the slow bullet inside David Barksdale let him be something more than a gangster. It let him be a leader of a different kind. But, and this is the hinge the whole story turns on, that moment could not last, because the money came with a spotlight. The United States Senate launched an investigation into whether the government had just handed nearly $1 million to violent street gangs. The newspapers turned on them. The accusation was that the leaders were skimming the federal cash, taking money from the very trainees they were supposed to be helping. And Mayor Richard Daley, who ran Chicago like a personal kingdom of his own, through the most powerful political machine in America, declared open war on the gangs. And you have to understand the climate Daley's war landed in. This was Chicago at the end of the 1960s, a city where the machine and the police treated organized black power of any kind as a threat to be crushed. It was the same Chicago where, in December of 1969, police raided an apartment before dawn and killed the young Black Panther leader Fred Hampton in his bed. That was the air David Barksdale was breathing. Any black organization that grew large enough to matter, whether it carried a gun or a breakfast tray, was a target. The window where a street nation could reinvent itself as a political force was slamming shut all across the city, and it was slamming shut on David, too. The federal experiment died, the grant money dried up, and the streets went right back to what they had always been. But David had taken one lasting lesson from all of it, that the war with the other black nations of Chicago was a war that ate everyone and crowned no one. So he made the boldest move of his life. He went to his biggest remaining rival, a young man named Larry Hoover, who ran a feared crew called the Supreme Gangsters, and instead of sending a shooter, he sent a proposal, a truce, a merger, combine the two nations into one and stop the bleeding for good. And Hoover accepted. Just like that, two of the deadliest organizations in Chicago became a single body, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. Two kings, one nation, King David and King Larry, ruling side by side. And the symbol they would eventually fly over all of it was a six-pointed star, the Star of David, for the king who started it. For a few short years, David Barksdale sat on top of the largest, most organized street nation Chicago had ever seen. He had come off a train from Mississippi with nothing, built a gang out of block kids, survived an assassination meant to end him, and united his oldest enemies under one flag. He was 30 years from the cotton field and standing at the absolute summit of the only world that had ever let him climb. And the whole time, the bullet was still inside him, still working. The wounds from that doorway never healed. Year by year, the damage spread. His kidneys began to fail, slowly, quietly, exactly the way that night in Englewood had promised they would. And on September 2nd, 1974, David Barksdale died. He was 27 years old. 27. The same age as the rival king who was born the same year he was. A boy who built a nation, dead before he reached 30, killed by a wound he'd been carrying for 6 years like a slow fuse. And here is the cruelest part of the whole story. He never saw what he built, because the empire was just getting started. The slow bullet took David Barksdale before the Black Gangster Disciple Nation became the monster it was destined to become, and without him, everything he had tried to hold together came apart. David had been the glue. His charisma, his vision, his ability to make enemies into brothers, that was what kept the nation whole. The moment he was in the ground, the old rivalries he had buried came clawing back up. The nation cracked straight down the middle into two warring halves, the black disciples on one side, the gangster disciples on the other, and those two halves turned their guns on each other and kept firing for decades. The grief did not even spare his own family. His wife, Yvonne, was murdered 3 years after he died. And years later, in a twist so cruel it sounds invented, one of his own children was reportedly gunned down by a member of the Gangster Disciples, the very organization that had grown out of the nation David built. The seed he planted grew into something that came back and killed his own blood. And the man who took the empty throne David left behind? Larry Hoover. And here is a parallel that almost writes itself. Larry Hoover was born in Mississippi too, in Jackson, just like David came up out of Salis, and carried north to Chicago as a small child, just like David. Two boys from the same poor Mississippi soil dropped into the same starving South Side who both clawed their way to the top of the same streets. They started as rivals. David, sick of burying his own people, turned his deadliest enemy into his partner. And then David died, and the partner inherited everything. From inside a prison cell, because by then Hoover was already serving a long sentence for a murder of his own, the killing of a young man he suspected of stealing from him, King Larry took the gangster disciples and built them into something David could never have imagined in his wildest dreams. Tens of thousands of members, more than 30 states, a street operation that federal prosecutors would one day claim pulled in around $100 million a year. An entire criminal nation, run with the discipline of a corporation, from behind the walls of a maximum security prison. Hoover formalized the structure. He created an alliance called the Folk Nation that pulled dozens of gangs under one banner, marked by that same six-pointed star. The thing David started as a peace treaty became, in Hoover's hands, the engine of one of the most powerful gang empires in American history, and the law spent decades trying to bring it down. Hoover was already serving 150 to 200 years for a 1970s murder. Then, in the 1990s, after a long federal investigation that secretly recorded him running the operation from prison through visitors' badges wired with transmitters, the government convicted him all over again. Conspiracy, running a continuing criminal enterprise, the works. They buried him under 6 life sentences in a federal supermax in Colorado, locked in a concrete cell, and threw away the key. And that should have been the end of King Larry's story. But it wasn't. But before we get to how that ends, there is a third king to account for, because David Barksdale's story began with 2 boys born in the same year, and we never finished what happened to the other one, Jeff Fort, the rival king, the other half of the nation that sent children to gun David down in that doorway. If you thought David's arc was wild, hold on. Fort took the Blackstone Rangers, renamed them the Black Stone Nation, and then in the 1970s reinvented the whole thing again as a sect with the trappings of religion called the El Rukuns. And then he did something no street king before him had ever done. From prison, Jeff Fort allegedly cut a deal with a foreign dictator, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, to carry out acts of terrorism on American soil in exchange for cash. A Chicago gang leader negotiating with a hostile foreign government to attack his own country. For that, in 1987, Fort was handed a sentence of 168 years. He sits today in the same federal supermax in Colorado that would later hold Larry Hoover. 2 kings, born the same year as David, who survived him by decades, one buried under a terrorism sentence, the other under 6 life terms, both of them entombed in concrete in the same Colorado prison. David Barksdale was the only one of the 3 who didn't make it out of his 20s. And now, the final twist. That should have been the end of King Larry's story too. But in May of 2025, 50 years after King David died from his slow bullet, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, after years of public campaigning by the rappers Kanye West and Drake, commuted Larry Hoover's federal life sentences. Sit with the contrast for a second, because the whole story lives inside it. King David, the founder, the visionary, the one who actually tried to turn the nation towards something better, got a slow bullet in a doorway and a grave at 27. He is remembered on a few South Side blocks and almost nowhere else. King Larry, the man who inherited David's nation and turned it into a $100 million machine, got Kanye, got Drake, got his name on a song lyric heard by tens of millions, and got a commutation signed by the President of the United States. One king built it and died young and forgotten. The other took it, ran it from a cell, and walked his name into the Oval Office. That is the arithmetic of the streets. It almost never rewards the one who started it. But on the South Side, they did not forget who started it. Every single year, to this day, they still throw King David a birthday celebration. Half a century after he died, the man who came off a train from Mississippi with nothing is still honored by the children and grandchildren of the nation he founded. And his name still moves through the culture in ways most people never notice. A generation later, when a young Chicago rapper carried himself a certain way behind bars, the old heads who remembered started calling that kid grandson, not because they were blood, but because something in the way he moved reminded them of the original King David. That is what David Barksdale left behind. Not a fortune, not a long life, not even peace. He left a name that outlived him by 50 years. A sharecropper's son, the 10th of 13 children, who got off a train as a frightened 10-year-old, who built a nation out of the abandoned children of a city that didn't want any of them, and who carried a bullet inside him for 6 years, ruling a kingdom he knew he would never live to see become an empire. King David, dead at 27, never convicted, never forgotten.